Hey everyone, just took me a second to get on the right button on OBS. I want to welcome, we're going to be joined with someone else later, but welcoming here first with the Lonely Wolf. Hello, nerd. And before we start the discussion, just to get everyone at least on the same page on the assumption that people have looked at the part 1 and 2, I'm just going to sum up part 3 so we can have a discussion of all 3 sections. So quickly, the section 3 of chapter 1, subsection 3 of section 1 of the social construction of reality deals with language and knowledge in everyday life. And what Berger and Luckmann hold is that human expressivity is capable of objectivation and that it manifests itself in products of human activity that are available to the producer and to others. So you can take something like an emotion like being angry, and you could, if you want to be very violent, stab a knife into somebody's door to symbolically represent that anger. It becomes objective and it becomes available. And even if everybody can't understand 100% of, say, the motivation or the context, they get the gist that you're angry. So what they say is that the reality of everyday life requires such objectivations, that the production of signs, which are an index of subjective meanings, are part of this process. And if we can think about an index of subjective meanings, an example would be like X marks the spot. It's some sort of symbol that represents more than just a letter itself. It's like a sign of something. That signs, and this gets into, if you know linguistics, you'll know a bit about this. Signs are clustered into systems. So signs make sense within a system, relative to other things. And that, what does it say? Not limited to the present. So you could have a symbol that lasts over time, that it retains its meaning. Signs have a detachability, which means they can be detached from certain things and attached to others. They're a bit flexible that way. And that language is our most important sign system. Understanding language is essential for understanding the reality of everyday life. And that is because language is capable of becoming the objective repository for meaning and experience. And here I was reminded profoundly of how Carl thinks that when he looks at, when he thinks about biological sex, that his language is reflecting objective reality rather than actually demarking what is a category through language. And he's mistaking the objective nature of language for he's missing the subjective construction of that objectivity. Anyway, they go on also to mention In face-to-face exchanges, there is also reciprocity. So it's not just the language that you're able to communicate or understand, but also the context of it. Language makes anyone's subjectivity available to me. So through the process of putting things into words, I am forced to systematize or structure my subjectivity, and then it also becomes available to my interlocutor. Language also refers here to the waking consciousness. So it's not like we use waking consciousness as a reference for our dreams, but the waking consciousness language reference is the one that is preeminent. Language forces me into its rules of syntax. So this is also quite important if you think about the way like German has genders and English doesn't. There are certain things that will go along with it within one language context that doesn't exist in another. Or even the way that you express yourself might be shaped by the way that your language works. So I'm reminded of in English, we say, we were at the wrong place at the wrong time. And in German, it's flipped. You were in the wrong time in the wrong place. So it almost kind of puts an emphasis on your existence as a being in time and then being located, whereas English puts more on your location and then the timing of that location. So I always found that's kind of weird. Language provides a way for the ongoing objectification of my experiences or objectifications of my experiences. So I can constantly take my subjective things and try to make it objective. It also typifies my experience within a broad category of meaning that I share with others. So if I have a frustration about something, I can context that within a broader category of, let's say, class alienation or like that other people could experience. Language bridges different zones of reality, such as like dream and art. It also transcends the here and now. It also constructs edifices of symbolic representations, such as the building of religion, philosophy, art, and science. Language builds up classification schemas that locate different objects, for instance, by gender in different languages, or it can even build up a classification system of intimacy. Again, we don't have this in English, but in French they have the vous, which is the formal, and the du, which is more personal. Or in German we have they have the sie, or which is more formal. Or the tu and vous, du and sie. Sorry, tu and vous. Yes. Let's see. What experiences we choose to retain through our language is selected by individuals and society. And then, without really signaling it, even though they mention they're going to talk about knowledge, they switch topics from language to knowledge. And I remember being, oh, why are we talking about knowledge all of a sudden? I don't remember this transition, but they do. So they kind of build on this notion of language and all of the elements of it, that we can use language to build knowledge, and then they sort of switch to knowledge at the end of the second half of the chapter. They talk about social stocks of knowledge, and that these are things that are routines performed, like routine performances of tasks are prominent in this social stock of knowledge. For instance, if I needed to get a passport, I might not instantly know all of the details, but I know generally I have to go to a certain office and I'll have to bring certain documents, and there's a process for that. So I'm already at an advantage of how to operate within that system. Knowledge of my own occupation and its world is rich and specific, but it's sketchy for other people. Also, my knowledge of their day-to-day life is quite sketchy because I don't have a direct experience of it. It's not part of my knowledge wheelhouse. Also, this is interesting. The validity of my knowledge of everyday life is taken for granted until a problem arises that cannot be resolved. So, for instance, like the validity of the binary of sex is just assumed as a taken for granted part of reality until it's challenged. Right? And then when people challenge it, they're like, what are you going to do? And that's where the problems come in. Knowledge is structured by its relevancy to me. And then they have this horrible tendency to just constantly use very sexist language. But anyway, knowledge is is socially distributed unequally. Not everybody has access to the same types of knowledge. So that was a lot. There's actually a huge amount to unpack there. I think I've gotten through the first 10 minutes. I think we're going to be joined by someone from Discord here any minute now, so I will let them in when it pops up. But I have talked so much on this, and I'm really interested to hear what other people have to say. So, the lonely wolf. start at the beginning or wherever you want to start and tell me about your thoughts on this book, any part of it you want to start with.
Yeah, so I was sort of saying to it backstage that I think the first few chapters of the book, I think the very beginning is when you start at the beginning. It is a very challenging book, and I was thinking, am I really going to be able to do this? But then I felt like once I got to chapter 3, it was more relatable, and I thought, oh, okay, things were starting to click, and I could feel the rhythm of the book. So I think that moving forward, I found the rhythm, so now I can continue going forward. So that was the interesting part of that chapter. But then it's like I was sort of taking notes as you were talking as well. It's like because I had things that kind of clicked like that. So sometimes the transition from dream into reality, or coming into full consciousness, it's kind of interesting how language plays a part in that, because I think in the dream world, you're obviously probably not talking. It's just this sensory experience, and it's so bizarre how language gets confused in the dream world. Like for instance, I had this really bizarre dream that I was gifted, by my family, 5 dogs. And, among those 5 dogs, one of them was, a panther type character. And I was just in the dream, I was saying, okay, this dog is probably my favorite. I can only keep this dog and I'm going to get rid of the rest. And then I wake up and then I thought, okay, that wasn't a dog, that was a panther. And so the language is kind of it's a kind of a tool for me to reorient myself from going into that dream world where everything's all mixed up into this sort of material world, where I realize, okay, the classification system for animals is somehow, and it makes me wonder, okay, why did I think of it as a dog in this realm? And in this realm, okay, it's like, okay, that was a panther.
Yeah, it's weird how it makes sense in your dreams, but when you come out of that,
Yeah.
like you leave that dream common sense behind you, or your dream understanding of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's because there's a lot of debate about, I guess, the question of gender, since I guess the emergence of a lot of people who talk about non-binary genders and everything like that. And I'm not sure what the problem is. Like there's some subjective things where there's other cultures that we've discovered anthropological records of, and still the current practice of some cultures who have a different classification system. But then even the scientific aspects of biological sex, once they come to light, it's there's kind of a lag in which people aren't really picking up on some of the things. Like it doesn't technically make sense to have binary as in male and female, because if you list all the characteristics of biological sex, so it's you could start with some things that have a binary, but then there's some variables that are continuous variables, like your hormone levels. Like that's a determination of biological sex. And so the idea that we have some variables that are continuous rather than discrete, that kind of negates the idea of actually saying this is a binary system. Like it might be a good system, but it's like a bimodal system is probably a more accurate system.
Yeah, in terms of its distribution. And by bimodal, you mean that there are 2 peaks, but they aren't.
Oh,
yeah. Go ahead.
yeah. It's basically, I think there are 2 peaks, and mostly, let's say it's whatever percentage of the population. It's the main body of the population will have, everything will sort of line up, everything like that. But then there might be like certain deviations that happen, outside those 2 peaks. It's rare, but it's still good experience, because that's like the disclosure. I'm one of the I guess non-binary is the word, but sometimes I'm behind on the. I've never really looked at the gender theory itself. I've just accepted it for what it is and just used the pronouns. So I don't really I'm not really sensitive to pronouns, or when I hear arguments that are at the contrary, it's like I'm not overly sensitive to those things, but it's still an interesting sort of intellectual, because I think it's the basis is dysphoria has been the main basis for which I can sort of think about that way. Because I guess to put it into context, there was a time where I thought, okay, I'm in the wrong body, but then the idea of transitioning is not feasible, because that dysphoria is cyclical. So it's on and then it comes off again, then it's on and it comes off in a predictable pattern. So I just sort of conceptualize that as being kind of in the middle, or I think of it as an abstract form of transsexualism.
Okay. Yeah.
Like existing in the mind, existing in the mind somewhere, in an imaginative realm, rather than in terms of a visible transition.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. I don't want to interrupt you. Like if you have other points that you want to bring up, so I want to make sure you have the full amount of time before I jump in on anything. So that's why I'm
Yeah,
hesitating. Sorry.
I was sort of mentioning because I was talking about a book that I read, because sometimes like fictional works, like I sometimes think of some of the works of fictions that I look at, and it reminds me of the film Cloud Atlas, like if the viewers have watched that film or if they haven't. So it's basically like a series of 6 separate storylines, and the first one starts off in sort of like a colonial time, so a shipmate, and then that story gets interrupted and somebody's reading that story, and that person is in their own storyline, so they're living kind of in a genre of, I guess it's that romantic 19th century fiction, so it actually reads like a different book, and then
Okay.
that particular story is being picked up by the next person who's existing in the I'm not sure what the year is, probably the 70s, so it becomes a crime fiction novel, and then it always cascades all the way up to the 6th story, so it goes into the future where there's cloning or whatever, so people are cloned to be service industry workers in Korea, and then the peak of that story is like a post-apocalyptic future, and that each of those are connected because somebody's picking up the story of the previous one. They're saying, "Oh, this is a book, I'm reading this," and then the next one is, "Okay, this is a film. I'm watching a film of this previous one." So the communication or the language, it comes in all these different mediums, but it's the one thing that ties the themes, and it's all to do with slavery or sort of, I guess, indoctrination, slavery, all those forces. And then the sad thing is, in the final story, it's in the post-apocalyptic world, the language has been lost, and so none of the mistakes that have been made by the previous generations could be learned about, or it's just the same mistakes were being repeated again and again.
Okay. Yeah, like I said, I'm just giving you space.
Yeah, and that's I guess the loss of language as well. I mean, when you lose books, because I think it happened in Nazi Germany, there were things like, somebody told me there was transgender literature that had been produced, but that got burnt, so that kind of set back the research, a long time.
Yeah. So I'm looking at this, and maybe you can talk about your experience of it coming from a more mathematics point of view. But I read this book initially as part of my preparation for my PhD. I remember I have this very distinct memory of being in Glasgow for some reason. I don't remember. I might have been setting up helping with a British election study conference or something. But I was reading this book in Glasgow, and I remember being upset by the sexism. But I mean, it's just like not upset by it, but it's just very irritating, the sexism of the language of this book. So it was distracting. But the overall points of it I found very illuminating, because again, referencing it to something more people can understand, Carl has this, and I'm doing this refutation video of Carl trying to mansplain gender, which is just garbage. But it's clear now, looking at it and understanding the evolution of science and philosophy, that he has a very naive, a very primitive, a very Enlightenment understanding of the role of like our perception of reality. And so he has almost like, again, kind of like a child of the Enlightenment. He hasn't quite figured out Kant yet. He just thinks that what you see is what happens. You just look at something, and because he has a word for male, he assumes that male is the accurate term for the thing he is looking at, and not really questioning who got to decide what counts as that before. So I'm just going to admit Mark here. Hi, Mark. Welcome to the conversation. I'm just in the middle of a...
So is that what Carl, is that what he has to say about gender?
Yeah, so basically it's symptomatic in the fact that in his video on gender, he made reference to Darwin and saying, well, we should go back and look what Darwin said, the Darwinian position on sex, which there is no Darwinian position on sex. But he's saying that, well, because Darwin concluded that sex is a binary, therefore sex is a binary. But the problem is Charles Darwin assumed sex was a binary. And so all his observations he put into a binary. And one of the things he talks about are castrati, or men who don't have, for whatever reason, like had their bits, before puberty damaged, and that they lack secondary sex characteristics. Well, one could make make an argument that there should be a category for that which is separate. Like you should have one with people who have secondary and people who don't, because there is an obvious difference there. But Darwin just sticks them into the male category. And so, so just let me start when we finish. So Carl he basically thinks that there's a pure correspondence between what people defined as male and what is male. He's just thinking he's reflecting reality, not that his reality has been shaped by the language of those who preceded him.
Oh, okay.
If that makes sense? Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have anything. Otherwise, I'm gonna drag Mark into this, because Mark bravely decided to join us, having not read the book yet. But did you have any?
I have some very basic understandings of social constructionism.
Okay.
I've been doing some reading of it for my thesis. So
that sounds familiar. That's when I read it. Yes.
But yeah, what was the question?
Oh, I wasn't sure if you wanted to, if there's anything particular that you wanted to bring up, or we can just keep kind of going with the conversation a little bit, and then you can jump in.
I'm happy with the latter.
Okay, that's fine.
I'm certainly happy with the latter.
I remember seminars that people don't necessarily want to be called on until they raise their hand. So I think what's important about this book, for some of its linguistic flaws, is that they are quite systematic in a way of just setting up in section 1, saying, okay, what is our everyday reality, and what are the necessary conditions for us to have an everyday reality. And section 1 starts with us. We have notions of time. I have to go back to my notes here, but the entire first section was really laying out all of the elements of our own existence that allow us to perceive reality and also to name it. So things like consciousness, and understanding the difference between dream world and the real world. This also the arts, that our realities are able to be represented, in ways that aren't always exactly lived experience. Not everything is limited, and that the way that when we are born into the world, everyday life appears as our ordered reality, that it's been prearranged in these patterns that appear independent of our perception of them. And this is precisely a great example would be sex. We're born into a world, we're taught this binary throughout our simplistic binary through our science lives, and it appears like it's ordered, it appears objectified, and and by participating it, we continue this notion, this sort of objectification, that it's not a subjective thing we're doing, that we're just reflecting reality, because and so it seemed a lot more certain than it is. Also, how our body and our perceptions organize the here and now, and also intersubjective, that we know that meaning isn't always exact between people, that we have to sort of mediate our experiences. What else they have here that I want to pull out? And then in the second one, they talk about social interactions. So they set up, people as the way that we perceive reality versus our participation in the creation of our daily reality. And then how we do that as two independent beings that come together and try to share these meanings. So we talk about, the past, the now, the future, that we have ways of stereotyping. They call them typifications, that allow us to they're heuristics. They're little shortcuts. Like if I learn someone's English, I assume they like drinking tea. And maybe they don't, but more often than not, they will, because it's based on some sort of generalization. And that social structures are the sum total of these typifications and the pattern of interactions that we repeat through them. And then they also talk about this sort of, we can talk about people in the future and we can talk about people in the past, even though they aren't meaningful to us in the here and now. Our here and now can be shaped by making calls to, I'm going to make the sacrifice for my children or for my country, or, my forefathers and foremothers made these sacrifices and whatever else. So the way that the past and the future can shape our decisions in the present. And then how we use language to communicate between each other, and then how we build up knowledge, and how this knowledge again seems independent from us and objective, when really if we go back, it was people who kind of created these things. So it's a lot of heavy going, I think, as you say, the first couple ones, and they're not great about signposting. I'm a big fan now, and maybe it's because it's the difference between writing articles, like scientific articles or peer-reviewed articles, and books. But these days, people don't have time to like read an article 5 times. It's like, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. Like, here's what I want you to know about this article, here's the article, and here's the things you should take away from it. And I feel like with Berger and Luckmann, I'm always looking for, well, what are the most important things that are going to set me up for future chapters? And they aren't great at doing that. So that's kind of my impression. Although it's worth sticking it out. I think this book is really important in terms of presenting a description of our own participation in what we think is objective reality. That's a lot I threw at you both, so.
Rosie, I've got to apologize because it sounded like I was like cutting in. I made this exasperated noise like halfway through. I was like, what?
And why was that? I'm sure you didn't mean to be exasperated.
I don't know, something you were talking about something that Carl said, and I'd sort of, and then I sort of made a bit of an exasperated. I'll keep those down. Yeah, I mean, I think it's okay. It would be easy for me to criticize people like that who talk about, sex, gender, being binary, etc., and then having those views. But sometimes I've got to admit that sometimes my theories, even as someone who's non-binary, like sometimes the explanations that I come up with and the things that I built, because I didn't really have a lot of language, because I grew up with this, and because I'm kind of the Gen X, it's kind of I guess a framework that you kind of build up in your own mind with your imagination. So I guess the theories that I put out there are probably equally outrageous and sort of untested. Like I sort of have this theory. It sort of goes along the line of, they talk about sort of biological evolution. So it's a purely biological process of the evolution of the sexes. So that's good. But then there's someone like me who's who's also asexual. So they're not going to reproduce. So, my role is in some sense, in the biological sense, is diminished because I won't continue my genetic legacy or whatever. But then on the other hand, I believe there's another system of evolution that runs parallel, and that's a cultural evolution. So I sort of believe that somehow, there's some people who have a very strong contribution to that. And I sort of see that with a lot of cultures that I've observed. Like I see it with, I don't know, the ritualistic impersonation. Like it's been through ancient times where you had the sort of Dionysian type, sort of, I guess, transsexualism, and then it evolved into, I guess, the drag shows. And sometimes sometimes kind of shapes the culture, because it sort of shows there's certain actresses that kind of elevate and they're sort of remembered, and sometimes that runs in line with drag culture. Like people like, let's say it's someone like Joan Collins or someone major.
Yeah. I'm making some notes here because I actually really, really like this point. This idea, you're right. Cause
okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, again, with getting back to Carl, because he's just easy, but we could use poverty and the way people kind of link a deficiency of moral character with poverty and a structure that looks objective but is actually a reflection of racism. But I think Carl and the sex, the illusion of, or the deception of the sex binary is important. The first thing is, if you don't have a word for something, it's very hard to describe its existence. I mean, this is one of the ways that language confines us and shapes our experience of reality. And because human beings were let's say, the men who got to be educated and who got to learn to write and were able to have their writings preserved over time, they saw the world in a simplistic binary. I mean, they didn't do a systematic study to think about things. They just sort of did that sort of as read. And also it was very convenient for them to make sure the world was very binary so that it kept their power lines, the lines of power very clear as well. And as a consequence, we were stuck with male and female linguistically. And that in some ways forces, again, you into a box. And so creating new terms and new language to represent those things is actually a conscious process. It's seeing a gap in the knowledge and seeing a gap in the observations, seeing a gap that needs to be filled, and then figuring out what to call it. And in that process, then you have to also give definitions and give examples and construct a new thing to describe those things that they don't have a name right now. So, I think about the fact that the Bible, for centuries, the way that it had an influence, it talks about the sexual assault of women and girls. but there is no place for empathy for men and boys who are sexually assaulted. I mean, the only way they are defined is criminally through, having homosexual relations. And so even understanding that boys and men could be a victim wasn't culturally or linguistically a category that they had. And so I think that we don't always reflect on the way that language limits and boxes us in. But then your other point, which I love this, because again, with Carl's video, he wants to use Darwin to say Darwin called the goal of sex procreation. But then again, Darwin's goal was to explain how sexual selection shaped human beings in the ancient past, like well ancient past. And so, of course, his only framework will be those who successfully reproduced. He's defining out any other evaluation because he's trying to explain what happened. But because you have a child, that doesn't mean you're a successful person. Being genetically successful doesn't say anything about the quality of your life or the happiness you produce or anything like that. So when you said, Lonely Wolf, about social evolution or cultural evolution, I love that idea, because you're right. We exist not only as biological beings. The whole thing about reducing people down to genitals forgets that human beings we have an entire conscious mind. And that is really what makes us and our society so unique. And to force everything down into biology is really just to deny us our humanity. And so when you want to look at evolutionary success in terms of culture or knowledge or society, people like me, I might not have kids, but I've got published works that other people in the future may cite and might invite more investigation. They might use my data set to build on that. Therefore, my genetic legacy is in a field of knowledge, not in my offspring. And so you can't say I'm a biological failure just because I didn't reproduce, if really what shapes life going forward, is not just life, but also the ideas in the societies and the seeds we plant that will be later, grown into a garden of the world we want to live in. And I really, really like that, because I was struggling I was calling what Carl was doing biological reductionism or biological essentialism, that we are only defined by our biology because, he's managed to get a woman pregnant, so he thinks he's done something. But what has he culturally contributed? What is he, and that point is exactly what I was looking for, is that when you reduce human beings down, he actually talks about breeding humans, siring children, like we know we're brood mares or whatever. And when you frame things like that, intuitively I knew that it was incomplete and wrong, but I couldn't give word to it until you came up with that phrase. So thank you.
Oh, here I was thinking that I was like, now that I've said that out loud in somebody's, because I thought it was something that was in my head. Like I was going to be talking about it on YouTube or whatever, and I've had this conversation on Discord behind the scenes, but never in public have I aired the sort of, because I just thought they were sort of too kooky to
I love it. It's like the cultural, it's like aggregating up memes. When Dawkins talks about ideas aggregating or ideas succeeding, a collection of successful ideas forms a culture, right?
Yeah, and it sort of comes from the experience, because there is a gap in language, and I can see it inside the LGBT community, because we're sort of, there's a lot of, I'm sort of a bit distant from the whole thing because there's a lot of infighting, but one of the gaps is between the sort of older people, because I'm of the Generation X, and then the sort of the current generation who are sort of, they're very conscious of the language they're using, and there's sort of there was a gap. I felt like I don't really fit into the current communities. Like I'd probably, if I joined a group like that, I'd probably be out in like 5 seconds because of my lack of knowledge. But I guess what I try to communicate is a kind of bridge between what was old and what's new or whatever. So I guess it's through metaphors, the language of metaphors. So sometimes if I'm talking about people say, okay, what is this gender? How do you define that gender? And is it real or is it not? Like sometimes I think, okay, there are some things that don't really appeal real. So the imaginary number system, like that was, it has a utility. People use it in mathematics, but on the surface, you're looking at it on a piece of paper, and your calculator tells you that this square root of -1 is not real, but it still has a utility. So sometimes utility is also the foundation for building language as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, Mark, any thoughts now that I've rambled a bit and our lonely wolf had some insightful things to say?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking when you were talking about evolution, and I was really thinking about how even now I think the idea, there's still within our language the idea that evolution is all about, the individual breeding, but I'm I would probably posit that it's more about the group survival, but we still sort of see it within that very individualistic framework. I know Carl certainly does, because I mean he needs to have something to call an achievement. Because I was thinking of, even when you go back to Darwin, he had male and female, but I don't think he really had a word for like homosexual behaviors in general.
No.
And except to think that they were deviant, which, that's a product of his time. But we might think, even in his time, we might think, it's a deviant human behavior, but we do know animals partake in it. And I think it does actually still have something to do with the survival of the group, even if it doesn't have to do with the survival of that particular lineage. I think there was a couple of gay penguins in the zoo, and what they loved, or what they did, was they would take in all of the like sort of orphaned eggs, essentially. So if any egg was, or chick was essentially given up by its parents, well, I mean, you got the gay couple who would happily raise it, and it still allows for that the continuance of that group's survival, essentially, the numbers, or however you want to frame survival in that context, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have a tendency within an evolutionary framework, and I mean, it makes sense because it's coming from biology, but to kind of like downplay the role of consciousness, self-awareness, culture, autonomy, freedom in a discussion of those kinds of relationships. Because if you're setting everything up in terms of reproduction being success, then you're missing out on what most human relationships are really based on. And yes, some people do have kids and they raise their kids together, but human relationships exist before kids, without kids, and after kids. Actually, if you have your human life, you might be rearing your children, let's say, like maybe up to 20 years, but you can have human relationships across, like 70 years of your life or 50 years of your life. So the main role of those relationships in individual meaning is not reducible to your success in having your offspring live to the age where they can reproduce. Like, that's not how we think about a successful relationship, nor is it how we think about raising a child successfully. Most people want to raise a child that has self-confidence, and is a good person, and it wants to, will make a contribution to the world. They're not thinking, oh, what's most important to me is that you breed. Like, there are some people who are like, I want grandkids, but that's not like, like, that's not even how we live our lives. So why would we value things like that?
Or people who say, I want my last name to continue on.
Yes, yeah.
Long after I'm dead, to have a boy.
Right. Yes. Right. So because society structures it a way where the male partner, their name lives on, then that is valued for people who want a sense of legacy. Whereas if it was with the female or with the women child or whatever, the girls who carried on the name, well, then it would completely change our social structures and our valuing. Right. So it's that selection is even socially determined, not evolutionary determined.
Yeah,
so,
but I mean, even within that, I'm sorry.
No. Go ahead, Mark, and then I'll bring in Tony.
Sorry, I was just going to say, like, even with that, there is still a hugely, just white Christian idea of, what it means to, successfully reproduce or, have your name carry forward. Because I think I remember reading somewhere there's a group somewhere in, I think it's Southeast Asia. And like, they don't marry, like, you might have long-term relationships, but it's not up to the father of a child to raise their children. It's up to the mother and her siblings, and that includes like her brothers. And the idea behind it is, or as I've had it explained to me, is a father might never know who his son is or who his child is, but an uncle will always know who their niece or nephew is. So are always, they're actually responsible for the family unit in a much more matriarchal sort of structure. And like, I know that sort of society certainly wouldn't benefit, a lot of white males who think in these very, very, very simplified ideas of relationships. But I mean, it's been successful.
Yeah. Property too, like viewing both women and children as your property. Is something that is more Western, where you say, like, you're completely able to have successful evolutionary biological outcomes in the structure that you just named, which is, a woman gives birth, and until you have IVF and things, you are going to be more certain, and then that family has that genetic link or whatever to pass on, and whereas in the West, what men have traditionally tried to do is control women's sexuality, control their fertility, in order to be assured of the patrilineage of their offspring, which creates a different social structure and different outcomes. So, Tony, hey, I don't know if you want to jump in here with some comments.
It says his name's Troy.
Yeah, why did I say Tony? I don't even know why I said Tony. I'm sorry. I think
it's a common mistake for my name.
Like, I just went a little bit dyslexic for a second there.
Yeah, I'm a Troy as well.
Yeah. So, Troy B, do you want to? You haven't had a chance to say anything yet, or talk about anything you had to say. So I wanted to give you the floor.
Nothing much to say so far. I've been agreeing with most of what's been said.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, and just one other thing I want to emphasize before I don't know how much longer this will go on, because I think we're kind of exhausting the limits of sections 1, 2, and 3. But I don't think reflect always on the arbitrary nature of how the scope of our definitions were determined. So the example that I used in a previous show that I did was that the way that we, in the West at least, I think English speakers, think of the word, what is a tree? We would think, if you wanted to do a definition, it would include something like it's, like a plant-like thing. It has bark, it has pulp, it has leaves, it has branches, it has a root system, right? And so we really limit it to its material components. But what if we thought about trees in terms of a process? What if we thought about trees in terms of the process in which they exchange carbon dioxide with oxygen? That would make them much more embedded within our climatology and our way of thinking about how trees interact. Not that they are, but they interact with air and also with the water system and the filtration and the minerals in which the tree is growing. So if we actually thought about trees not as things, but as processes, as a living process, as a chemical process, as opposed to a material object, how would that then change our entire approach of understanding ecology? And that's a choice that was made for us a long time ago, and we didn't have a choice in it. But it appears to us, it's a sensible definition, it's a workable definition, but it's not the only definition we could have used. And I think a lot of times the way that we have had the world handed down to us is slightly arbitrary, and we tend to give a little too much deference and respect and treat with some sort of certainty or almost like a divine authority. This is what an appeal to Darwin is, I think, for Carl, is, well, Darwin said that sex was a binary, and he was, someone who knew about these things, so we have to listen. But, all of these things can be questioned and renegotiated because language is our tool, it's not our prison.
I think it's somewhat of a mixture of the traditionalist and etymological fallacies, because I understand that a lot of the words that we have, they come from history, and they were developed based upon what they know. So if you look at the idea of a tree, we think of it as having branches, a stem, bark, because I don't want to say people in the past didn't think abstractly, but they didn't know about the chemical processes.
Right.
They
Precisely.
didn't know to think, a tree is a carbon store that produces the air we breathe. But today we're now saddled with all of that. Basically, what's the word I'm looking for? But essentially, we're saddled with the definitions and everything that we bring with that knowledge. So we know as a tree as, that thing with bark rather than, or we've got that primacy effect of that's how we think of trees, not as carbon stores or not as thing that produces the air we breathe. And God damn it, do we need that?
Yeah.
But, but yeah, and then it's a question of, well, how do we renegotiate that? Because, the problem with things embedded within, our language is that they're very, very hard to eke out. And some people don't want to think too deeply about those things.
That's it too. It scares people. It scares people like Carl. If you feel like the world is certain and it's stable and it's structured and you can count on it, and then someone comes along and smashes it, this can create a lot of anxiety and uncertainty, because something that you thought was quite stable and reliable and helped you to structure your life now has been ripped away from you. I think about how I felt when I realized democracy in America wasn't this solid institution. It was actually quite flimsy. And a lot of it was just customs and socially accepted norms that people chose to follow because they had a sense of honor. And all it took was one person who was a sociopath to completely destroy a show. Basically, it wasn't so much that Trump destroyed democracy so much as he kind of was like the man behind the curtain, showing that the Great Oz was an illusion that we'd all collectively bought into. And so I can understand where that can cause a little bit of a sense of vertigo, a sense of not knowing how to, like, having something that was a safety net or a comfort blanket that you could count on taken away from you. But on the other hand, it's more tyrannical to force outdated, inaccurate, convenient for the majority views in defiance of all observation, scientific understanding, and reasoning.
It was very for me. The presidency was so jarring because it was this cognitive dissonance, and I think it was amplified by the fact that the previous president, so with Obama, I think that what he restored to the White House was a certain amount of dignity that comes with that title, that appeals to a lot of even traditional values. Like he sort of exemplified a lot of family values. And then you see Trump, and I don't see him as a politician. Like, I understood him as the, reality TV star, the one who was in Twitter, the one who's abrasive. And I even enjoyed some of his times, like the Apprentice. And I used to watch that. I used to enjoy that sort of stuff. And so I enjoyed him in that respect. But then when he was sort of like in the president's seat and then carrying on with that behavior and continuing that same mentality, I just thought my head just went all over the place because it was this cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, no, I completely.
I don't know how to explain it.
I know, it is, and it is anxiety inducing, and it makes you. For me, when I was saying things about like Russian interference and Trump's fascism, I felt like my language was accurate, but I shouldn't be saying these things. Like there was a real disconnect between what I saw happening and what I believed should be happening. What I wanted was a stable democracy. What I had was a complete farce being exposed, and so again, it's very anxiety producing when you have, and one of the terms that I used for when I deconverted from Christianity, I looked at a lot of different people's stories of when they deconverted, and it's usually like it starts with a little doubt, that people can pacify if you're born into a religious household, that is, and then there are more doubts, and then there's something at some point you hit that people would describe kind of hitting something they can't reconcile. It's a cognitive dissonance, and it goes and it goes and it becomes so intolerable they have to resolve it. And because they can't go back to their old blind faith, they are forced into what I call world collapse. All of the things they thought they knew were true, all of the things they relied on, all of the things that guided their lives, structured their social interactions, their understanding of their place in the universe, their belief about what would happen to them after death, it all collapses. It all falls apart. And they are left, in some ways, they feel like their lives have been destroyed. Part of them they're mourning the loss of it. But what they then come to realize, and why their atheism ends up being so firm, is that it clears out a lot of bullshit. and it creates an empty space. And that space is what they're not used to, but then they realize they can use that space to build their own morality. And the foundations of that belief system that they construct from the rubble of what they pick and choose out of religion and what they decide to bring in from different elements or humanism, what else, is far more solid and far more solidified because it comes from their beliefs, not from what they accepted on faith. And so there is that kind of world collapse phrase that I use to describe that the space between losing everything you thought was real and reconstructing a reality that is on a much firmer foundation because it's grounded in your own values and experience. So that's not to do anything with the reality.
Can I ask you a question, Chrissy? This is because you've been on the ground of the so-called culture wars when it was used to be the so-called SJWs and the so-called anti-SJWs or whatever, and it's like something. What I noticed on a particular side of the debate was there was everyone was united in talking about atheism and the rejection of religion, but it seemed like on one side of it there was a culture of personality in which there were these particular people, and let's say someone like Jordan Peterson or someone like that, and it's sort of hard to argue against some of the points because they say, oh, you just have to read like this, or you just have to watch this series or whatever, and
you don't 50,000 hours.
Yeah. And there's a lot of people. It's kind of a cult of personality, and it seems to be. And I think it exploded because then we saw the rise of that internet blood sports, which kind of decimated that whole kind of. It's no longer really a community. It's just left in all these different fragments or whatever. And so that was the saddest thing of all to see to see something like that become of that. It just offends every sensibility because I've had friends of mine who've been dragged into that IBS nonsense, irritable bowel syndrome or internet blood sports. I don't know which one you'd prefer.
Yes.
Yeah. And so it's kind of what I saw there was a collapse of a certain, I guess, a belief system. And yeah,
but only partially.
What's your take on this, Christy?
Yeah. So my view on this was when so what I think happened with a lot of the people who started glomming onto Hitchens, glomming onto Dawkins, is that they kind of replaced God with this misunderstanding of science. So they wanted to give the kind of certainty to science that they had previously had with religion. When we talk about like that illusion of certainty that language sometimes gives by the way we use it and the way it presents itself to us. So what they did was they kind of took out God and faith and they replaced it with science and snark, or sarcasm or witty comments. But they didn't actually abandon any of the real values that they had inherited from religion, like misogyny and hierarchy, unjustified authority. Whereas for me, unpacking religion was also about unpacking its misogynistic past, its patriarchal structures and power, and the way it kept certain people down and privileged others, unjustified hierarchies and all these. So for me, I think that there were a group of people who used atheism as a way to get to humanism. And then there are people who thought they were humanist, but they were really just people who had, for them, God was dead, but they hadn't changed anything about their lives other than saying God was dead. If I want to borrow from the spoke there, Zarathustra, if you say, yes, God is dead, but nothing about your values changes, nothing about your life changes, nothing about the way you think about things changes, then God really hasn't died for you. You're saying it, but you're not living it. You're not owning any of your own morality. And so I think that attraction to the arrogance, the certainty, in some ways the false certainty, because if we want to say anything about science, it should be tentative and always ready to correct itself. And yet people like Armored Skeptic, when he would make videos where he would just read out of biology textbooks to make himself sound really smart because he was reading other people's writing, he was able to assume a mantle of authority he had not earned and did not deserve by taking on the authority that people were willing to, that people who had expertise, they transferred that authority to him because he was reading their words. And it became false gods. They became like new false gods to these atheists.
Yeah. Well, they replaced religion with scientism.
Yes.
Not so much a respect for the process of science.
You just said it in one sentence.
Yeah.
I should have just said that. No, but sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, or no, yeah, it's not a respect for the process of the scientific method, but rather just this very Ben Shapiro-esque facts don't care about your feelings, but I'm not going to read too much into the facts.
Yes.
Because, even like the idea of pulling out a biology textbook, like, that education and understanding doesn't end at the textbook.
Yes.
And that's like, the amount of arguments I've had on Twitter, and I really need to stay off Twitter, but, it's people saying, well, okay, well, show me where it says biology is, sex is a spectrum in the textbook. And it's like, you're not going to find that in the textbook because the textbook's written for a certain audience in mind,
Yep.
And with, certain political agendas behind it as well, because, we live in a society and not always a good one.
Yeah.
But if you look online, you'll see biologists, in respectable journals talking about, well, maybe we should look at it in this way. And it's
nature.
then dismissed out of hand because, well, it's not in the textbook.
Yeah.
And there's that. It's like you've replaced the Bible or the Quran with a science textbook written for like middle year students.
Yes. Aimed at 12 to 14-year-olds.
Mm-hmm.
And then the argument comes about, they say, oh, but what about that? What about all the hoax journals that they do? Because there was that little project where there was, I think the name was,
SoCal Squared.
Helen Pluckrose.
Yeah,
and
Bogosian.
James Lindsay.
Yeah, all the
so
frauds.
it was sort of the problem with the main thesis that they're trying to put together is that, frauds can be perpetrated in any discipline. Like, I think, because I know that like Professor like Philip Moriarty, I know that like he spends a lot of his time trying to because a lot of the ridiculous ideas that come within the realm of physics, it's like and people think, okay, physics, like there wouldn't be any sort of fraud going on there, but it does happen. Like people will perpetrate a lot of hoaxes in any academic field they want.
Well, it doesn't even necessarily need to be a hoax, because there were people
terrible
who were,
science.
what was it? Yeah, or it's not even necessarily terrible science, but there's a certain point where you're just focusing on very theoretical stuff. Like supersymmetry, for example, was meant to, I think, resolve the problems between, quantum and like non-quantum physics, and it failed. Like, do we call that a hoax, or do we call it bad science, or do we just call it, a failed attempt? And, when it comes to hoaxes, yeah, you're right. Anyone can participate in a hoax, because I think all that SoCal Squared bullshit demonstrated was that if you put something into a peer review process, they'll take it at face value that you're trying to do the right thing, that you're not trying to hoax them.
Yeah.
Like, I think they took away the wrong idea from that, because they're so invested in this idea of, the social sciences being ideologically driven.
Yeah, and also the other thing too is just because one slightly eccentric, shall we say, article gets published in a minor feminist journal, it doesn't change women's studies, across the world. It's just like one article in one journal that your library probably doesn't subscribe to. Let's face it. So, getting published, it does take work to get published, absolutely. And especially to kind of go through some sort of peer review process. But if you send your article off enough and you have enough, and this was the other thing that they don't mention, is that it sounded to me like what Bogosian and Lindsay did was, not did they just sort of send something off, and then if it got a revise and resubmit, they tried to take it to a different journal and submit their work. They actually incorporated the comments of their reviewers into their own work. And so it stops, like those other people were trying to rescue their shitty ideas. And so, that's what your peers try to do, is if they think there's something that you could pull out, they work with you, they give you positive feedback, they give you instructions, check this thing out, check that thing out. And you might not even agree with the conclusions of the author, but if you think that they've made a case that makes sense within the framework of what they're talking about, then you can go ahead. Like, this isn't my thing. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I think, if you're going to write an article on this, then you've done the minimum things required to be published in this, 2-star journal or 1-star journal or whatever it is. And the other thing too, that I don't think people understand about the scientific process or knowledge production even, is that when you study something intensely and deeply, you don't become more certain about it. The deeper you go into a topic, the less certain you become about what you really know about it and what you can really say about it.
That happened to me in the maths major.
That happens in every field.
Yes, but if you don't do that work, you have this illusion of certainty, like the way that quantum mechanics just blew Einstein's mind. I mean, he had the intellect and capacity to understand it, but because it was so different from the worldview, the way he thought about stuff, it made him, I think he was uncomfortable. God doesn't play with dice. It made him uncomfortable to think about a probability being the basis of the building blocks of reality, not determinism. And so, the more we study something, actually, the less certain, more humble we should become about it, the more circumspect and circumscribed we are in how we discuss it.
So you went, when you first, when you're first in college, like the very first time you had to take a data analysis course or basic things like probability and stochastic theory, like, did you find that a little bit upsetting to the equilibrium? Because we sort of think that, because I guess in high school we thought, okay, I know how to calculate the standard deviation, I can calculate the mean, I can draw a graph, and I think this is what statistics is. Like, how did you feel when you first?
Well, we didn't, so I should say, like, I took my master's was in political behavior. I had to take a theory class, a political behavior class. I took British politics, and I took one other class. I can't remember now. It was 4 classes. But I went to political behavior, and I had come from an undergraduate degree where we didn't include, it was in the 90s, so we didn't include statistical analysis. It was more like political studies than political science at the undergraduate level. And so when I came to political behavior, and my professor wrote, y equals a plus x1 plus x2 plus x3. I'm like, that's not political science. That's not politics. I don't even understand what you're doing here. Like, it didn't even make any sense to me that you could map out someone's probability of voting for a party purely using mathematics. And so that was like world shifting to me in terms of thinking about the quantification of behaviors in that way and systematically and with a null hypothesis. So when it came to learning the methods, like, I ended up doing a summer school on logistic regression because I needed to do logistic regression for my master's dissertation in order to do the work I wanted to do. But it was really more utilitarian. Like, I had to learn enough about the theory to understand what I was doing. Then I had to learn the software. Then I had to learn the outputs and then how to interpret them and write them up correctly in order to pass my, So there was, I think more it was about the shift from almost like a qualitative understanding of politics and campaigning to a quantitative worldview of behavior, and from like a behaviorist 1960s, very quantsy sort of worldview. I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, it's okay. So that's such a. I think your experience is like it's like the opposite mirror, because it's like from the political science, you're coming from something that was it's science and art. It's kind of like the two things sort of merged together. But then it's like, okay, then you discover a mathematical world. Whereas okay, even though I said I studied maths, like I'm not a doctor, so like I'm just a plain old mister. So it's like I'm kind of a little lower on the rung. But I started when I decided I was going to major in math, and I thought, okay, math is this discipline where, because I've done it in high school, and I thought, okay, I can do calculus and I can do statistics because, we did one type of hypothesis test, and it was just based on, a single variable. Okay, easy. It's just based on the sample mean, like easy. But then I remember the very first statistical science lecture, it was he said, statistics is not a subset of maths. I was thinking, okay. So that was one thing they said, and the other thing they said was that statistics is an art and science. And I said, why are we using the word art? And then from then on, and then the uncertainty in which people were talking about, because I was just saying, Professor, can you just tell me, how do I do this? Just tell me step 1, do this, step 2, do this, like I do with calculus or whatever. But it's sort of like, it's complicated. And then when you go into the stochastic side of it, it's there's certain things, like, because you've sort of seen that in politics, certain variables or whatever, and there's a whole mathematics of that. And then that in itself was infuriating because, and then the nature of proof itself as well. Like, I just wanted to apply the thing, but then you have to understand how the thing works beneath that. So that was, I guess, my first year was a wake-up call, and in the second year I sort of thought, okay, this is how I need to be thinking there's proofs, and there's also uncertainty in there. And then from then on, I felt a bit better. But then when you go to teach it, because that's like, I spent years as a classroom teacher in that, and I still do a little bit of teaching here and there with maths, but then you got students who demand certainty and knowing, and then you're speaking in terms where I never use the word like, must we always do this? You have to do this. Like, I always avoid that in my language because that's what I learned. I sort of developed myself that way. But then when you got a group of students who are saying, why are you saying, don't we always do this? But I always think in the back of my mind, but what if there is one exception to this particular rule?
Don't want to set them up.
I had to go back to it. I had to go back to the language of certainty when I went back to teach it. So it was,
even though you knew that it wasn't accurate for the simplicity of the students and their anxiety levels.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, do this, do that, like, well, what is it? You have to learn how to paint, like, according to the rules, so you can break them like an artist. Or jazz, you have to learn how to play all your octaves so you know how you can play around with your octaves. But yeah, there is that illusion of certainty when we're first taught something because it's presented so simply. And that's a reflection of the language we use, and how we choose to present it, even though we know it's not completely right.
It's sort of like when you're a kid and you think your parents have got it all together and they know what they're doing. And then you grow up, you realize, oh my God.
They're just people.
They're just people and they had no idea.
Yeah.
And now I have no idea.
Yep. Yes.
Mark, I'm trying to place your accent.
Take a guess. It's
like either British or Australian. It's a weak accent. It's kind of like mine. It's like, because I get the same thing. It's not a very strong accent.
Are you an expat? Have you moved from somewhere else?
No, I've been living in the same place for 30 years. South Australian.
Oh, okay. I thought so. It's not a strong accent.
Yeah, it's probably the most British of the Australian accents.
Yeah, sometimes your ah sounds slide into that kind of RP or generic Southern British accent.
We don't sound like Bering.
Oh God, no.
Because that's a strong accent.
Yeah.
Whereas what you got from Mark and I, like, we both represent a weaker accent.
No, a more cultured accent.
Yes.
That's true.
All right. Well, this has been a lovely discussion. I'm just kind of thinking if there's anything else people want to discuss or bring up before. I think we've been going for like an hour now, which was about what I wanted to do. So before we head out, does anyone have anything that we haven't discussed that you wanted to? And what are your questions? Talk about, this is framing. I was told this, that you shouldn't ask a group of people, does anyone have any questions? Because then people, only the most keen will raise their hands. So if you phrase it instead of as, what are your questions? It assumes that people have questions and you're giving them the invitation to bring them out. Yeah. So otherwise, going once, going twice. 3 times for people. Okay, for people in the chat who might not have had a chance to jump. Like, so I've been running, like the video here, the OBS, making sure YouTube is working, and occasionally checking Discord. But I can, if you can DM me or get a hold of me, I don't know, some other way, or someone in here, we can give you an invite to the book group. I have to say the Discord is pretty quiet. What it generally is when I get around to it about once every week to 10 days, I'll dump some notes into the Discord, and it'll usually be before a video comes out so people can use the notes to follow along. And going forward, I think I'm just going to do it on a bit of an ad hoc basis. I really didn't feel there was enough in sections 1 or 2 alone or even together to sustain a long-term conversation. But by the time we got to 3 with language and knowledge, I felt like we had enough. So if in future chapters there's substantive enough content to warrant a discussion, we can do them after each section, or if we want to kind of build up 2-3 more and then take another piece. So it's going to be a little bit of playing it by ear, I guess. Otherwise, thanks to everyone who stopped. Thanks you all for coming and having an interesting conversation. It's so nice. I don't get to nerd out like this as much as I used to when I was in a university setting.
Oh, no, I love it.
And especially with Corona, I don't even get to talk to my colleagues about nerdy things to do with like big data management or data sets or anything. So thank you so much. All right, well, I guess then thanks to the people in the chat for stopping by. And also, yeah, I like the text-to-speech too. I realized I wanted to do something that was a little bit more friendly for people who had hearing impairments or something. And because Google Meet allows it, I was like, yeah, I'll turn on the comments. So if that got a positive reaction, I'll do that as well going forward. All right. Well, goodbye from me then, and goodbye from our readers. Say goodbye, readers.
Readers, thank you.
Bye, readers.
Oh, we'll work on that.
Oh, sorry, we did it wrong. Goodbye,
right.
Readers.
There you go.
Say goodbye. Say goodbye, readers.
Goodbye, readers.
Goodbye, readers.
Hey, I got to do the bit.